Sorry, folks. I'm aware that there's no sound, and I've asked the sound person to check into it.
One of the, wow,
There we go.
one of the reasons I really like um, the candle lighting at the beginning of the service is that it's so elemental. You have matter turning into energy, oxygen and carbon turning into flame and casting heat. And, you know, just think about over the course of our lives, especially those of us whose lives are been going on for more than half a century, how much less contact we have with those elemental things. You know, there were some of us when we were young, you would have to light a fire somewhere to make breakfast. Some of us would spend whole stretches of the time in the summer having to go to the outhouse. Some of us, maybe even their whole lives, going out and feeling the rain and the wind. We used to have so much more of a visceral experience of the world. And so just this little flame reminds us of the fundamental alchemy of the world in which we live. And since this service is going to have a little bit more of a contemplative feel, I'm going to invite you into an awareness of elemental things. First of all, biblically, it's always great to start with the breath. Just become aware of your breathing. For those of you who have some training in Eastern traditions, you know that there's a spot about an inch below your navel that's really important in the Chi traditions. If you put your hands there and take a deep breath into that place, you kind of notice that, oh, the whole body's becoming energized, right down to the legs. And you can exhale down through and imagine the breath, the Chi, going down into the earth, which is a great awareness to have as we move to land acknowledgement. Become aware of the fact that there's a hard wooden board, still comfortable, behind your backs where you sit, and maybe lean into it a little. And notice what happens to the set of your neck when you lean back into it. Or what happens if you gently press the bottoms of your feet down. Even sitting, you notice, oh, look what's happening to my posture. And that makes breathing easier. These are the kinds of things that choir directors are teaching choirs all the time. Welcome to worship. Welcome to your body in worship. Welcome to full-bodied worship. And welcome to a ritual space in which things get turned into each other, in which oxygen and carbon get turned into fire, in which the sore spots in our hearts get turned into healing, in which the walls that divide us personally, those kind of ways we seal ourselves off with emotional armor, get softened and we connect more deeply with each other. Welcome to a human and spiritual experience that we call worship. And it's out of this place that I'm going to invite you to actually try to share something elemental as we pass the peace. I've said this lots of times before, but in some Eastern traditions, when people greet each other with a namaste, it actually means both the divine in me acknowledges the divine in you, and the light in me acknowledges the light in you. So, as you pass the peace this morning, whether it be on Zoom or in person, try to catch the light in somebody's eyes and honor that. The peace of Christ be with you always.
And also with you.
I'm going to continue in the contemplative vein with the land acknowledgement. And again, moving back into the elemental awareness of the bodies that are present here, you're all sitting on and leaning on wood, which grew out of land. Transformation of elements. All of us, through gravity, are able to stay here in this worship space and not float away or bounce off the ceiling, because we are literally being attracted to and pulled into land. Let's stay mindful of what we touch as we sit, and mindful of how we breathe. Even the oxygen that keeps us alive would not be possible without the interchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in billions of trees and trillions of microorganisms in the sea. This is all land. So I'm going to invite you to breathe and to remember the land and lands on which you have lived, the ones you've called home. There are people on Zoom who are sitting in Germany on the banks of the Severn River, maybe in Nova Scotia, Alberta, Perth. Let's let our memories and imagination settle down into all the lands we have called home. And let's remember all of the first peoples who have lived on, journeyed across, and stewarded those lands. Let's shift to hearing with our inner ear, the spiritual ear. What claims upon us does the acknowledgement of those first peoples make? And let's use our faculty of imagination to imagine how we would live on land differently if we truly had right relations with Indigenous people. Amen. Okay, I invite you to stand as you're able and cast your eyes upon the screen, and we will read responsively the call to worship, which is adapted from this week's Psalm 133. How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion.
Good morning. Today's reading is taken from Genesis 45, 1 to 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Send everybody away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they as in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and rulers over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son, Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I'll provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. The second reading is from Matthew 15:21 to 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she kept shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. These are the words of life, which in faith become the living word.
The sermon title is a little bit less provocative than last week. I hope the sermon isn't. One of the things that drives me a little bit bonkers about the lectionary is that we seem to have certain weeks where just not a lot in it. And then we have other weeks where there's like 3 or 4 great pieces of scripture. And the latter seems to keep happening in August. Like, why not, in late November? How's the sound, by the way? Is it clear? And the passages this week, the two that Beatrice read for us, I find really powerful. And over more than 3 decades of preaching, I find them getting more and more powerful. The first one, the story of Joseph and his brothers, picks up on the reproductive politics of what we were talking about last week. Remember, for those of you who were here, Jacob has these 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, and he's trying to get them pregnant, and he's not doing so well. So they start bringing their servants into play, and then they all get pregnant. And they produce lots of different children. And so you get all these half-brothers, including Joseph, who is the child of Rachel, Jacob's favorite. And the cluster of half-brothers become resentful of him because they can tell he is their father's favorite. And then there's a little bit of the story just before our passage where Joseph becomes a tattletale and tells their father on his half-brothers, and now they're really not happy with him. So at one point when they're off in the desert, off in the wilderness with herds at some distance from their father and the farm, they see him coming and they decide to kill him. But there's a little intervention, and they decide instead of killing him, just to take him and to throw him in a hole, and then to sell him into slavery, and he's carried away to Egypt. And he goes through all these trials and tribulations in Egypt, but eventually becomes, because of his ability to interpret dreams and to predict the famine, he becomes essential to the Pharaoh and the household of the Pharaoh in Egypt. And then his half-brothers, who beat him up, threw him in a hole, contemplated killing him, and then sold him into slavery, find their way to Egypt because of the famine, in search of grain that is stored away. And they're brought in to see him, and they see who it is, who the kingly official who controls their fate is. And I'm sure their first reaction is not repeatable in church. They're toast. They're toast. But the story does a complete 180, because Joseph doesn't do what they think he's going to do. Joseph doesn't do what they would probably do to him if the roles were reversed. Instead, he breaks down into weeping and lamentation so loud that the whole of Cairo hears it. The Egyptians hear him crying and wailing so loud in lamentation that it echoes throughout the great palace and city. Now, when I was rereading that passage this week, it reminded me of an experience I had over a period of months or years in the late 90s. And that was when I got to witness the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. For those of you who don't know, South Africa lived under a terrible racist regime, under a regime that implemented a policy called apartheid for generations. And as we moved through the 80s and into the 90s, anti-apartheid violence, and then violence from the police state, white police state, against the black and mixed race people in South Africa was getting worse and worse. And the American State Department was predicting that there would be 100,000 violent deaths in the transition to black power. But something miraculous happened, and there was a peaceful transition. And as a way of healing the nation, South Africa launched the greatest experiment in the history of national healing, the greatest experiment in political forgiveness that the world has ever witnessed, called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How many people, I see most people who have been around long enough to remember, but how many people remember those images of Archbishop Tutu convening these hearings, and Nelson Mandela? And Tutu placed himself exactly in the position that Joseph was in when his brother showed up. He and his people had been oppressed and murdered and enslaved in multiple ways for generations. And he was put in charge of this great process of reckoning with the past. And the first thing they launched was human rights violations hearings. And they had person after person come and testify to all the human rights violations that had happened in the process of apartheid. And you could expect that there would be great condemnation of the apartheid state, the apartheid policemen, the apartheid bureaucrats, and all of these white people who cooperated with apartheid. But instead what happened was there was a great, along with truth-telling and a lot of telling of fact, a great release of emotion. And on many occasions, Archbishop Tutu, when convening one of these hearings, broke down and wept. And it was common to see a picture of him sitting at his sort of judge's table, bent forward in his clerical clothes with his head down on his hands and his body shaking as he wept with tears. And you know what he did for an entire nation of oppressed people? He modeled the release of pain, anger, grief, anguish, instead of the alchemizing of those feelings into hate against their oppressors. I wrote my PhD on this process. And I am convinced that without this process, the transition in South Africa would have been enormously more violent. And many people emulated Tutu in this process. But some didn't. As I was doing my field research on this process, I knew I needed to talk to some of the architects of apartheid, and some of the killers, some of the apartheid state police who'd carried out assassinations and torture and beatings. And so I did. Mostly I talked to them in the hallways at amnesty hearings. Sometimes I talked to them in interviews. Most of them hard still. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do what Tutu did. Actually get into the emotional core of what their lives had been and find some way into release. Bothered me, but I'll tell you what bothered me more was the number of Western journalists, North American and European academics, commentators, who looked at this release of emotion and pejoratively called it the Kleenex Commission and spoke scornfully about a process that engaged emotions so deeply. That really got under my skin. My dissertation title was Baptizing the Nation with Tears: Truth, Political Forgiveness in South Africa. And what I realized is the scorn that some of the white South Africans and some of the architects of the apartheid state and all kinds, and this wasn't everybody from Europe and North America, by the way. Many people were tremendously positively moved. But by the kind of the arrogance of a large number of Western and Northern academics and commentators in speaking scornfully about this emotional process, had something to do with their own inability to go in here really deep. Their own inability to allow the emotional power of this process inside their bodies and their lives and to transform them as they went home and acted differently in their own cultures. The opposite happened to me. I came home and found myself involved with truth and reconciliation processes throughout the decades that followed. You see, this passage has everything that Joseph does bracketed with weeping. He starts out with these loud, loud sobs. And then he speaks gently to the half-brothers who've oppressed him. And then he wraps his arm around Benjamin, and they weep on each other's necks. And there is a physical, visceral reconciliation happening there. Now, the other passage, there's a mutual recognition of humanity and a restoration of their common humanity. The other passage that Beatrice read starts off showing the opposite. And shockingly, the bad guy is Jesus. Who knows where Tyre and Sidon are? Southern Lebanon. So at this time, what's happening in this passage? Jesus, and he's not going to be alone. Jesus is not wandering alone through southern Lebanon, hanging out with Canaanite women. Would have gotten himself in multiple forms of trouble. He's with at least some of his followers. But he's gone there, I think, for a break. He's left Israel, and he's up in another country away from all of the work he has to do. Yeah, he's sort of on vacation in southern Lebanon, which is a beautiful place. Makes some of the best wine and some of the best Iraq in the world today. And then he's confronted with this woman from a different culture, a different race, a different religion, a Canaanite woman. We talked about Canaanite religion last week, right? And she's got a daughter who's possessed by a demon. And she needs him to heal her. And Jesus is like, can you not see I'm on retreat? Leave me alone. You know? It's like the minister who doesn't want to receive the phone call on the day off because he, she, or they are too tired. I can empathize. But she keeps at him, and finally he says, woman, should we take the food for the children, i.e. the children of Israel, and give it to the dogs, i.e. you and your people? Now this thing that I remembered immediately upon rereading this passage today, which looks so much worse in my eyes than it did 35 years ago for some reason, was what's happening in European soccer at this point. There's a great controversy happening in European soccer, especially around a player named Vinicius Jr., who is from Brazil and who is very black. And when he scores goals, he likes to dance and celebrate. And much too often, and he scores a lot of goals, and when he's dancing and celebrating, chants of monkey, monkey, monkey arise amongst the supporters of other clubs. And they've spread. And now more black players are being called monkey. Jesus is in that position in this passage. I mean, the courage to write this and to include it in the New Testament, I mean, that's some truth-telling. That would stand out among truth-telling in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Jesus is tired. Jesus is not acknowledging the mutual humanity of the Canaanite woman, and so he's turning to the same kind of scorn. He is looking at this woman and he's saying, "Woman, we're a mismatch. We don't belong in the same place. We're a mismatch. We're not part of the same tribe. We don't belong to the same religion. We don't see the world the same way. And so, forget about it." Now, in our culture today, he'd likely just be canceled in some form. But she is so desperate to have her daughter healed that she does not react to this humiliation, but uses wit to make him see her humanity. And somehow, through her quick wit, which is like an arrow into his heart, he goes, "Oh my God." I was going to say, "Oh Jesus," but he is Jesus. "Oh my God, what am I doing?" And the scales fall from his eyes, and the armor falls from his heart, and the fatigue falls from his body, and he recognizes her humanity, and instantly, in the mutual recognition of humanity across these barriers, the daughter is healed. He doesn't say to her, "Oh, I will heal her." He acknowledges that she's already healed. The demon of othering, the demon of otherness has been cast out, and the daughter is healed. At the deep level of common humanity, there's no mismatch. When we get to this place, with the honest truth-telling of the heart and the body as well as the mind, all can be healed. Friends, the scorn of the refusal to go to the heart is alive and well in our culture. Last week, in response to my sermon, by the way, thank you. People kept me back here talking about last week's sermon for 50 minutes last week, especially TSP folks. You really went into dialogue with me. Thank you. What you were saying last week is, well, what about the rise of the right wing? What about the Trumpites? What about the conflation of right-wing religion and right-wing politics? Well, it's happening on the left too. And what's happening is, like, folks who are articulating this unholy combination of right-wing politics and religion are people who are losing things. In a time of tremendous inequality, most of these people are falling through the bottom of the middle class. And when that happens, we have a lot of negative emotions. And we look around for somebody to call a dog or a monkey. It's at some reason it's easier to turn to scorn than to really feel and process what we're feeling, which would actually liberate us to doing something more about it. Our culture is filled with that scorn. You can smell it online. Unfortunately, Our churches sometimes are filled with that. And you can smell it when people refuse to go to the depths of their hearts and they project something onto the other and they're scornful towards them. So let me finish this sermon by offering an invitation. My mentor, Bill Coffin, used to use the phrase, "It was a wonderful experience, except at the time." The process of going deep into the heart and feeling the grief and the anger and the pain and the loss is a wonderful experience, except at the time. It heals us and it liberates us into a future filled with creativity and hope. We've got to have the courage to drop the armor and to realize it's going to hurt to move through all of the sources of bitterness and brokenness and non-recognition of humanity in our churches and in our culture. But we've got to go through the experience that is wonderful, except at the time. And we've got to go through it together. May it be so. Let's breathe again. You've been working your ears and your faculties of listening, maybe even feeling, but let's remember our faculties of breathing. And as we move into this offering, let's forget about money and just say for yourself in your heads and in your hearts, this is the spiritual and emotional energy I have to offer in this moment. What is it? To offer myself, to offer the people I love, to offer the world. This is the spiritual and emotional energy I have to offer. Friends, may your hearts unfold like flowers before you. And as your heart unfolds, may God plant a deeper measure of her love in that spot. May God run some courage up your spine like iron so that you can go into the world facing its challenges with head held high. May God plant a greater measure of joy in your feet so that you may move through the world dancing in body or in spirit. And finally, may God plant a greater measure of mischief in your eye so you can go into the world and make righteous trouble where it needs it. Friends, go make trouble. God bless you. Amen.